We've been looking at some of the questions Jesus asks during his ministry. We turn to at least two more today in John chapter 6. We pick up the story in verse 56. Jesus speaking, "Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in them. As the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so whoever eats me lives because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. It isn't like the bread your ancestors ate, and they died. Whoever eats this bread will live forever." Jesus said these things while he was teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum. Many of the disciples heard this and said, "This message is harsh. Who can hear it?" Jesus also knew that the disciples were grumbling about this. And he said to them, "Does this offend you? What if you were to see the human one going up where he was before? The Spirit is the one who gives life, and the flesh doesn't help at all. The words I have spoken to you are spirit and life, yet some of you do not believe." Jesus knew from the beginning who wouldn't believe and the one who would betray him. He said, "For this reason I said to you that none can come to me unless the Father enables them to do so." At this, many of his disciples turned away and no longer accompanied him. Jesus asked the 12, "Do you also want to leave?" But Simon Peter answered, "Lord, where would we go? You have the words of eternal life. We believe and know that you are God's Holy One." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, something was wrong, terribly wrong. The disciples knew it. The crowds were coming to see Jesus, and the crowds were getting bigger and bigger. But all of a sudden, there was almost like a change in tone in what Jesus began to teach. At this, the crowd started to dwindle. They started getting smaller and smaller. When we come to this point in John's gospel, no one is wanting to make Jesus king anymore. No one is pledging allegiance to him anymore. One by one, the people that Jesus had captured by his words, they were starting to leave. Now, John chapter 6 is one of the longest chapters in all of the Gospels. It is the longest chapter in the Gospel of John. It has in it two miracles. Jesus feeds the multitude. Jesus walks on the water, but the bulk of John chapter 6 is Jesus dealing with his disciples, dealing with the people around him. One thing you see when you read John's gospel is this: John does not include the sermons that Matthew and Luke include. John doesn't have a Sermon on the Mount. John doesn't have the parables of the kingdom. John doesn't do all of that teaching stuff. John is more focused on Jesus reacting to individuals. The woman at the well, the lady caught in adultery, the man born blind, those type of folks. So we have to really understand what is going on in the synagogue in Capernaum that day, and we have to do so by looking at some of the other Gospels, because we know what Jesus has said to the crowd. Jesus has told the crowd, you need to love your enemies. Jesus has told the crowd that his kingdom was a kingdom that if they were going to follow him, they would have to value people more than things. That they would have to value generosity over greed. That they would have to value peace over war. Transparency over secrecy. Humility over arrogance. Honesty over deceit. Integrity over popularity. And that they would have to value the power of love over the power of amassing more power. That they would need to build bridges rather than erecting walls. Apparently, this was not what many of the disciples that had come to follow Jesus had in mind. Because John tells us that as he is in Capernaum teaching, many of the people said, hey, this is not what we signed up for. And they began to walk away. And they began to desert Jesus. I wonder why. Wonder why this happened. Why did many of Jesus' disciples turn away from him that day in the synagogue? Well, perhaps they were tired of hearing people argue over religion. These early disciples were struggling. They were struggling to survive in a dangerous and in a scary world. This world had no safety nets. And the last thing they needed that day in the synagogue was an argument about religion. What they needed was words of hope, words of encouragement, something that would help them face another week. And many of the disciples, I think, who walked away from Jesus were intimidated by the religious leaders who were very upset with him. Because they realized if they continued to follow Jesus, this Jesus who now was making these religious leaders very upset, this Jesus whom the religious leaders called a heretic, if they were to do that, these followers might too be targeted for abuse. And that was the last thing these people needed. They had enough problems to handle without making life more difficult by associating themselves with some itinerant preacher. Maybe that's why they walked away. We get a lot of, I don't want to call it junk mail, but that's kind of what it is. Unsolicited advertisements, I guess, here at the church. Someone wants to sell you a book. Someone wants you to attend a conference. But a few weeks ago, we got something, and they were wanting you to buy a book or a program or something. So take this for what it's worth. But they gave a study. And this study said that people ages 18 to 25, this age group of ages 18 to 25, 24 out of 25 of them never go to church. That 24 out of 25 people ages 18 to 25 never go to church. The other one that does averages attending church 12 times a year. It's about once a month. One of the main reasons that this age group gives for not wanting to go to church was the fact that they were tired of going to a church where people argued about everything. That ought to hurt us. That ought to sting. You know, churches are splitting all the time. Most of the time. The things that churches are splitting over do not make a bit of difference. Rarely. I think one time I have heard of a church that were splitting because of something that actually made a difference. It was a church in Patrick County around Spoon Creek. And some of the people left and built them another church. What was it over? The resurrection. Some aspect of the resurrection. Now, folks, that's something to fight over. That's something to split a church over. The resurrection. But the sad part is most of the churches that split, most of the churches that break up, they're not fighting over the resurrection. They don't have differing views over the resurrection. It's more about who has the power. It's more about who gets their way. You know, if this pandemic we're going through has anything to teach us, it is that being together is so important. Oh, how I miss gathering with the church, singing the hymns, feeling the love. And I hope that this pandemic teaches us that us being together is far more important than many of the small things we fight about. Maybe that's why some of the people walked away from Jesus that day. But maybe, more probably, I think many of them walked away from Jesus that day because what he was teaching them was tough. It was tough. They were looking for someone who was going to make this religion thing, this Christianity thing, simple and easy. It's not what Jesus was doing. If anything, Jesus was creating them more problems. I don't know who it was who got people to believe that once you become a Christian, that's the end of your problems. Heard one preacher say one time, yes, when the day I became a Christian, that was the end of my problems. Unfortunately, it was the front end. These people were looking for something easy. That's not what Jesus was offering them. So they walked away. They turned around and they left. What are you thinking about walking away from? What is it that you are thinking about walking away from this week? Who are you thinking about leaving? How long have you thought about this? Why do you think it would be a good thing to do it? What kind of impact do you think it would have upon those around you? Have you talked to anybody about it? Have you prayed about it? So often I meet people and they go from one thing to another. They leave one job for another. They leave one relationship for another, one circumstance for another. And the moment they get to the new circumstance, everything's perfect. And this is going to be the best job there's ever been. And this is going to be the best relationship they've ever been in. But before too long, they run into trouble and they're ready to move on, to move on, to move on. Is that where you are this morning? Is there a tug of war going on inside of you? Are you trying to figure out what you need to do about your job? Are you trying to figure out what it is you need to do about your marriage or a friendship or a relationship of another type, a relationship to a family member? Are you thinking about dropping out of school? Are you struggling with your faith? Are you unsure about whether you want to continue to be one of Jesus' disciples or not? What does this passage teach us about those of us who may be fighting this tug of war inside? Those of us who may be like some of these disciples who said, I'm not sure this is what I signed up for. And I'm thinking about walking away. What does this passage say to us? First of all, I would say this. This passage teaches us that we should never walk away from something just because it's tough. It appears that many of these people walked away because they were looking for someone who would make life and faith easy. A leader who would bring order to their lives and remove all uncertainty. When Jesus didn't do that, they walked away from it. And they moved on to the next holy man, hoping that he would fulfill their fantasies. You've probably been riding down a country road, right beside of a cow pasture, and you have witnessed this cow sticking his head between the fence, eating the grass on the other side of the fence. You have heard the saying, the grass always looks greener on the other side. My friend and colleague Daniel Collins said something profound one time. It shocked me too. But Daniel said, if the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, you can bet it's because there's more cow manure on the other side of the fence. He's right. And if something is worth having, it's worth working through. If you really want to have a successful marriage, you've got to work at it. Somebody said one time that marrying is easy. Being married is hard. Becoming a parent is easy. Being a parent is hard. But those of you who've been married for years and years and years, you know that if you walked away when things got tough, all the blessings you would have missed. Those of you who have been a parent and have witnessed your child go through these phases, tough times. But on the other side of it, you know if you had walked away because things were tough, all the blessings you would have missed. Don't walk away from something just because it is tough. I don't know what you're thinking about quitting today, but I hope you're not doing it because it's too hard. Somebody said mediocrity never leads to happiness. And when you've done less than your best and not achieved your potential, you will be very unhappy, if not miserable. Sadly, we could go all around this country and we could hear people say, I wish I had. And I grieve when I look into their eyes because you can see the disappointment in their hearts. People who quit because things got tough. Don't walk away from something just because it's tough. Secondly, don't walk away from someone who wants the best for you and believes in you. That day in Capernaum, people walked away from a man who wanted the best for them, who loved them unconditionally, and who was willing to give everything for them. Everything he had, he was willing to give. Yes, he had great expectations for them. But this was because he had much confidence in them. He knew that they could live up to these lofty ideas he had, to these dreams, to these radical demands. He knew they could. But they turned their back on him, and they no longer followed him. Oh, friend, think twice. Think twice before you walk away from someone who loves you and someone who believes in you. Because these people are hard to find. But they are absolutely essential for you. Simon Peter realized it, didn't he? The disciples were grumbling. I think they had gotten used to the big crowds. And honestly and truly, if you see a big crowd, it gives you some adrenaline. When the crowds got a little bit smaller, the people were, the disciples weren't too happy. I think they liked all this talk about king. They were grumbling, John says. So Jesus looks at them. And here's his question. Do you want to leave too? Do you want to go? I wonder how long it took them to answer. I wonder if all of them all of a sudden were looking down at the ground. I wonder how long it was before Peter speaks up. Of course it was Peter. It's always Peter. Peter said, Lord, where can we go? You're the one who has life. You're the one who has meaning. Lord, I'm sticking close. You see, Peter realized that people like Jesus, they don't come around often. And you better stick to them when they do. Don't walk away from the people of God. Don't walk away from the people that God sends into your life. Don't walk away from a God who loves you. And finally, don't walk away from people who need your help. As much as these followers needed Jesus, he needed them. He didn't go to the temple in Jerusalem to choose disciples from among the religious elitists. He went to the humble villages around the Sea of Galilee. He chose common folks because he wanted this to be a grassroots movement. He wanted these to be everyday people. But they turned away from him and his dream. You know, important decisions aren't always about you. Years ago, there was a big book written. Well, the book wasn't big, but all the fanfare around it was, The Purpose-Driven Life. One of the first sentences of that book is, it's not about you. Important decisions are rarely about you. In fact, I'm not sure they ever are. Every decision you make impacts somebody else more than you probably ever will know. So who needs you to roll up your sleeves to help solve a problem instead of dumping it into somebody else's lap? Who needs you to rise to the challenge and lead in a way that's best for everyone? Who needs you to hang in there when the going gets tough instead of abandoning them? Who needs you to believe in yourself as much as they believe in you? Who needs you to be a vital part of a team, offering your expertise and encouragement? Who needs the gifts, the skills, the abilities you have to offer at home, at work, at school, and at church? Think a long time before you walk away from people who need your help. And those people in whom you can make a huge difference in their lives. From this time, John says, Many turned away and didn't follow him any longer. What are you thinking about walking away from today? You better think about it long and hard. You better pray about it. But there's one more thing I want to say. Do you need to reconsider a decision you've already made? Maybe in this passage, you find yourself as one of these who've already walked away. Maybe in this passage, you are one of the ones who said no thank you. I hope and I pray that many of these people in John chapter 6 were in that crowd in Acts chapter 2. And they realized this Jesus was who he said he was. And they came back and started serving him in the church. I hope and I pray they were. If there has been a time when you walked away, I want you to know this Jesus welcomes you back. His arms are open. Maybe you left and you've realized now, hey, Peter was right. There's nowhere else to go. He'll take you back. That's the type of God he is. Thanks be to God. Amen.